Hello, my name is Rebekah Hauser. Thank you for listening to our presentation, a comprehensive longitudinal study of government DNS deployment at global scale. Operating an authoritative DNS or ADNS name server has never been an easy task. Even early in the existence of the DNS, misconfiguration errors were common. Since then, the DNS has only become more complicated, and these common misconfigurations have persisted, with new issues being added to the mix. Researchers have repeatedly measured the extent and impact of many of these errors. Some of the most common issues examined relate to resilience. Resilience is usually measured in terms of replication and distribution of authoritative name servers, or of dependence on third-party DNS providers. Other common configuration errors examined by multiple researchers include defective delegations and inconsistencies between zones. These works all point to the fact that while the authoritative DNS deployments for many, if not most, domains are fairly robust, a non-trivial number still deal with configuration issues. Further, since these works largely focus on popular domains, or those high in the DNS hierarchy, they are likely only capturing a small percentage of the misconfigurations that exist within the DNS. Of course, we must recognize the trade-off between the time and energy needed to maintain a pristine ADNS deployment and the cost if something is misconfigured or not highly redundant. In some contexts, maintaining redundant ADNS servers in multiple networks is not a high priority. However, for some domains, DNS availability is much more important. Among these domains requiring more attention are those used for e-government. E-government services play an important role in many societies, a role that grew substantially over the past few years as the COVID-19 pandemic made populations more dependent on certain aspects of e-government. Many e-government resources are accessed using domain names and are thus dependent on the DNS. Given the value of e-government domains, we want to examine to what extent domain used for e-government are beset by common DNS misconfiguration issues. Before diving into our measurements, I want to briefly review some basics of the DNS. Recall that the DNS comprises many zones. A zone is simply a collection of all the information that exists within the DNS describing resources within a portion of the namespace. To give an illustration, suppose someone purchases the domain example.net. The owner of example.net will create a file containing all the information for example.net that the owner wishes to publish. That information is a zone and is stored in a zone file. To make this information available, example.net's owner needs to place that zone file in authoritative name servers, which will use the information to answer inquiring resolvers. The owner is supposed to arrange for at least 2 name servers to provide the same information. This practice of having multiple name servers is what we mean when we refer to replication. RFCs recommend that the name servers be placed in different physical locations and networks. And this separation helps to ensure that the zone stays available if one of the name servers is temporarily unreachable for some reason. Continuing with our illustration, example.net's owner needs to tell the owner of the domain immediately above in the DNS hierarchy, that is, the net TLD, where to find example.net's name servers. The record that example.net's owner shares are added to the net zone, which is the parent zone. Currently, this notification process relies on mechanisms outside the DNS and requires manual involvement. The specifications for the DNS require that the information for parent and child zones be consistent. However, partially due to the manual effort involved in updating information, zone files contain inconsistencies relatively often. These inconsistencies can cause performance issues and may represent problems such as dangling records. If an authoritative name server listed for a domain does not respond to queries for that domain, the domain has a defective delegation. A defective delegation may occur for various reasons. For example, the domain may be relying on a third-party provider for DNS services, and that provider's systems may change, or the domain owner may change authoritative name servers but forget to let its parent domain know. As with inconsistencies, defective delegations can lead to performance issues, but may also represent more serious problems. Now, moving on to our measurements. Our first step was to identify a list of government domains. This was not as straightforward as one might expect. Ideally, we could simply use domains in a top-level domain or effective top-level domain, that is ETLD or TLD, reserved for government use. However, the list of reserved domains varies widely by country, so we would need to examine registry policies for each country individually. Even if we could find such policies, however, we noted that governments sometimes use domains in TLDs other than those reserved by the registry, even domains under generic TLDs. The task of identifying e-government domains was further complicated by the fact that attackers will spoof government domains, so manual analysis of a domain that claims to be a government resource could be unreliable. Finally, it's not clear how rigorously the policies restricting the use of reserved domains are enforced. It might be possible for an attacker to gain ownership of a domain in a reserved TLD. To identify a list of domains that we could be confident belong to governments, we decided to start with a list compiled by the United Nations. The UN maintains the e-government knowledge base, a website containing various resources related to member states' e-governments. For each member state, the knowledge base contains a link to the state's designated national portal. Countries self-report much of the information about their e-governments, and UN researchers also examine the government websites. The approach they used to determine the domains associated with national portals gave us confidence that the domains we found belonged to and were being used by governments. We use these domains to seed a larger search for government-related domains. The domain names in the national portal links are host names and only point to a specific site associated with the government. We believe that the governments were likely to use other domains within the same zone for various purposes. The challenge then was to identify which zones, for example, the ETLD or registered domain, we could safely use. To make this determination, we used a combination of registry documentation, registrar policies, NS records, and questionnaires in the knowledge base. This yielded a set of what we call our base domains. We used the base domains to search a large passive DNS or PDNS dataset for NS records belonging to our base domains or any of their subdomains. The PDNS dataset we used, Farsight's DNSDB, contains records collected since 2010 from a globally distributed network of sensors and from select zone files. Some of our measurements evaluated this PDNS data. We also used the PDNS data to build a list of domains for which we collected additional data via active queries. To select the domains to check via active lookup, we first extracted those seen in the PDNS data in the previous year, and these measurements were run in early 2021. We then performed some additional filtering to remove what appeared to be disposable domains. And this gave us finally a list of over 147,000 domains to query actively. We performed the active data collection from a server in the University of Delaware's network. Given a domain to query, a query client first checked the authoritative name servers of the domain's parent for the domain's NS records. If any of these name servers returned a referral, the client sent the same query to the domain's authoritative name servers. Responses from both zones were recorded separately for further analysis. In the PDNS data, the number of domains with NS records grew over the course of the past decade from 113.5 thousand in 2011 to 192.6 thousand in 2020. The number of distinct name servers seen in the dataset per year followed a similar trend. Interestingly, most of the name servers seen in the data were not in the base domains we studied, suggesting that governments rely largely on third parties to provide ADNS name servers. This is a point we'll come back to later. Our active data collection yielded data for 115,000 domains with at least one response from a name server in the parent zone. The first aspect of ADNS deployment we considered was that of replication. That is, how many authoritative name servers do the domains in our dataset use, and are these distributed across multiple networks? For the first question, we examined trends over the past decade using the PDNS. We characterized the replication for each domain using the median number of simultaneously active name servers for the domain over the course of a year. That is, given a domain and a year, we find all the days in the year on which the domain appeared to have active name servers. We determine if a name server is active based on the first seen and last seen timestamps that are added to the records in the PDNS dataset. For each day, we note how many name servers were active. We then take the median number of simultaneously active name servers per day over the year to determine the degree of authoritative name server replication for that domain that year. In the example illustrated here, we would say that example.com had 2 authoritative name servers in a given year. The results of our measurement give mixed messages regarding the state of replication. Between 2011 and 2020, the number of domains in our dataset with a single authoritative name server increased by a factor of 1.2. While this increase shows growth in the number of domains not meeting RFC requirements for replication, the percentage of domains in the dataset with this condition has actually decreased slightly from over 4% to about 3%. This observation raises the question of whether or not the appearance of domains with a single authoritative name server is largely due to older systems, and if new domains are generally using replicated authoritative name servers. To answer this question, for each year between 2012 and 2020, we checked the percentage of single name server domains appearing that year that also appeared in 2011, and how many single name server domains that had appeared in 2011 were no longer active. A substantial percentage overlapped, particularly in the early years, but by 2020, only 21% of the domains using a single authoritative name server in 2011 were still in the dataset and using a single authoritative name server. So clearly, the continued existence of domains using a single authoritative name server cannot be attributed largely to older domains, and many new domains also contribute to this group. Of course, redundancy requires more than having multiple authoritative name servers. As noted earlier, it is recommended that some name servers be placed in different locations or networks. Using the data from our active data collection, we evaluated how many domains listing multiple authoritative name servers followed this recommendation. To estimate the diversity of server locations for each IP address to which a name server resolved, we checked the /24 subnet and used Maxmind's GeoIP to ASN, that is Autonomous System Number database, to find the autonomous systems managing the IP address. We found that for over 71% of the domains in our dataset, the name servers resolved to IPv4 addresses in multiple subnets. However, only about 33% covered multiple autonomous systems. Overall, these findings point to relatively diverse placements of authoritative name servers. Both measurements are relatively low compared to the percentages found in a similar work by Ullman in 2018. In that work, Ullman found over 85% of domains studied used authoritative name servers with IP addresses in multiple /24 subnets, while 72% of domains actually had servers in different networks. The difference between those results and ours is likely due in part to the difference in the character of the domains studied. Ullman focused on popular domains and domains at the second level of the DNS hierarchy, and these require more robust ADNS deployments than do less popular domains or those lower in the hierarchy. We focused on domains that are not necessarily popular and included several in lower levels of the DNS hierarchy. As a final note, we observed some cases of a single IP address shared by multiple name servers. That is, a domain had multiple authoritative name servers listed in its NS records, but these resolved to the same IP. More than half of these cases were linked to domains in a single government domain, so the behavior seems largely driven by the idiosyncrasies of a single system, but was nevertheless somewhat surprising. Several researchers have noted trends in the centralization of the internet over the past few years. That is, more and more entities are relying on fewer and fewer big players for services such as web hosting, content distribution, and DNS services. We wanted to evaluate to what extent this trend towards centralization affects government domains and how it has progressed over time. We used the passive DNS data to look at how many governments are using third-party DNS providers that are commonly used by popular domains. We measured the percentage of domains in our dataset that use these providers in 2011 and 2020. We also checked the percentage of countries and subregions that had at least one domain using these providers. The subregion groupings are mostly those assigned by the UN. However, for the 10 countries with the most records in the PDNS data, we considered these as having unique behavior and treated each as its own subregion. Finally, we also examined what percentage of domains relying on a single provider used one of these popular providers as that single provider. We found that the use of major providers is prevalent and increasing. We were particularly interested in the growing percentage of domains using Amazon and Cloudflare. This percentage increased from virtually none in 2011 to more than 2% in 2020. 2% may seem low, but we must keep in mind that the number of domains using these providers increased by multiple orders of magnitude, and many of these domains are only using name servers belonging to these providers. We see that although many governments use their own DNS infrastructure or services of local providers, the number of government domains using these top providers is increasing. We next examined defective delegations. For this, we relied on the results of our active data collection. We found that almost 30% of responsive domains had a partially defective delegation in at least one zone. Slightly over a quarter of the domains had a defective delegation in the parent zone alone. Since defective delegations may indicate dangling DNS records, we checked what percentage of the domains with defective delegations were at risk for domain hijacking. Most were at little to no risk of hijacking, as they involved name servers and domains belonging to governments. For the remaining cases, that is, cases where the name servers were and domains not owned by governments, we checked if the name server domains were available for registration. We found 805 that could be registered, and the median cost to do so was about $12 US. The name servers in these domains were used by over 1,100 domains belonging to governments in 49 countries. Finally, we examined inconsistencies in NS records for a domain contained in the domain's authoritative name servers and the name servers of the parent. That is, we are checking for zone inconsistencies. Over 3/4 of the responsive domains in our dataset had no inconsistency between authoritative name servers in the two zones. While this percentage is fairly high, we noted that it was substantially lower than that in a previous work, where more than 90% of the responsive domains had no inconsistencies. Similar to the case for name server distribution, we found that the rate of consistency is generally higher for domains at the second level of the DNS hierarchy than for domains at lower levels. In the other work, only domains at the second level are evaluated, while we examine domains at different levels of the DNS hierarchy. As in the case with defective delegations, some of the cases of inconsistency may represent dangling DNS records. We checked the name servers involved in inconsistencies, excluding those that were also defective, since these were covered in the previous measurements. We found 13 of these domains were available for registration. And the name servers in these domains served 26 domains in our dataset belonging to governments in 7 different countries. Moving on to discussion, let's first look at some of the limitations of our study. The governments we studied may use domains besides the ones associated with the national portals for many of their resources. We have already noted some of the challenges in identifying the domains used by governments. Developing a more comprehensive list of domains for a wide range of countries was beyond the scope of this work, but is a promising area of future work. Another limitation was related to our active data collection. For these measurements, we ran queries from a single vantage point in the US. We might have obtained different results if we had used additional vantage points. We considered, however, that e-government websites are unlikely to distribute content from multiple regions, and we did not consider the results would vary greatly across multiple vantage points. Thus, conducting measurements from multiple vantage points was not a high priority at this stage in our work. We repeated certain measurements to account for transient failures. However, due to a mistake in the design, we did not repeat all the measurements that we should have, which may have led us to slightly overestimate defective delegations. This lapse would have affected less than 2% of the domains that we studied. Finally, we did not try to determine if any domain hijacking attacks leveraging dangling records have taken place for the domains that we studied. Doing so would have been non-trivial, especially when trying to determine if such incidents occurred in the past. This was also beyond the scope of our work at this time. Now moving on to potential remedies. As stated at the beginning of this presentation, running an authoritative name server is not easy. We do not expect there are any simple solutions to the issues we have examined. Still, we believe the value of government domains merits some effort to address these issues. Regarding the number and diversity of authoritative name servers, we considered that updated guidance or requirements on developing DNS deployments would be helpful to address this situation. Those managing a domain's authoritative DNS deployments may be challenged to find the right balance between redundancy and the complications of acquiring multiple servers. While relying on third-party providers can help with this task, the use of such providers also increases the attack surface of domain, as attackers can exploit vulnerabilities of these providers to hijack domains. For defective delegation and inconsistency between zones, the best means of combating these issues appears to simply be continued diligence. Tools for DNS debugging already exist, and some popular authoritative name server software has the capability of detecting defective delegations or inconsistency between zones. These tools have complications, of course, and may include provisions that require out-of-band communications for certain updates, but are nevertheless helpful. Given the technical resources that already exist to maintain DNS health, it seems that what is needed is continual attention to developing human supports. As our measurements show, most DNS configurations studied were robust and consistent, demonstrating that this human element is already very strong. Through this research, we hope to highlight the problems that do still exist and encourage additional attention in this area. To recap what we've covered today, we have shown that DNS misconfigurations are not uncommon even among domains used for e-government, a context in which the stakes are relatively high. We've seen the growing centralization of the DNS extends even to e-government domains, and these are increasingly relying on the major players to provide DNS services. Finally, we have noted that many of the misconfigurations we've seen belong to e-government domains that are vulnerable to domain hijacking through dangling NS records. Thank you for your time. Please reach out to us with any questions.